So when it comes time for pruning the roses, you actually want to go out into the garden with the proper tools. You want to be armed for battle. You'll need a pair of gloves. You'll need a good pair of, I use bypass pruners myself. So a bypass pruner is a blade with a hook, and when you close it, it's a scissors action rather than the other type of pruner is an anvil where the blade comes down on a flat surface. If you use those, you have to keep them sharpened all the time. Bypass pruners should be sharpened as well, but it doesn't require constant sharpening. When you do use these, my pair happens to be probably 30 years old, so it's worth buying a good pair, and they will last. You do want to keep a sharpener on hand, something to clean the blade. That's called a Sandflex block, and again, that's 30 years old, and keeps your blade clean of any kind of corrosion. If you can't cut a cane, a rose cane, if the thickness is such that you can't cut it with a pair of bypass pruners, if it won't fit into there, don't go sawing at the cane with the pruners. Get a pair of pruning lopping shears. You want to actually lop with a pair of these, and keep these very sharp as well. If they aren't sharp, you'll just end up crushing the cane, and you don't want to do that. If you can't cut with a pair of lopping shears, you actually need a handsaw. This one's a little large. This is actually more for doing limb work, but I have some large roses, and the oldest canes on them will actually require something of this size. You want a good sharp saw. If it isn't sharp, probably go and buy yourself a new one or have it professionally sharpened. But when you do have old, thick rose canes that do need to come out of the plant, you'll need something that has some heft to it. So this is a hybrid tea called the McCartney rose. It's got a very great fragrance, by the way. It's a nice pink flower. And if you're wondering about pruning with flowers still on the plant, that's perfectly fine. We did mention back in the segment about November that leaving rose hips on the plant will actually help the plant go into dormancy. So this rose, it's still actually in active growth, and the pruning will actually help send it back into dormancy as well. So on a hybrid tea rose or a Floribunda, some of the hybrid tea climbers, the pruning can be fairly vigorous. On other plants, we'll show you an example in a little bit, the pruning is a lot less. So on a hybrid tea, what you're actually wanting to do is to cut so that you are making new growth happen. The new growth is what will give you the flowers. And you want this structure, you want the structure at the end of it to be an open vase work with the growth eyes, and a growth eye happens anywhere that there's a leaf. You can actually see them as small swellings on the plant. You want those to be facing outward. So anytime you make a cut, you want to cut just above one of those so that the new growth coming out will actually arch outward, and you want to open up the center of the plant. Now on this plant, it hasn't been here for a while. You can actually see there's a deck of growth down here right at about hip level. That's pretty much where we want to prune the plant, a little bit further down from there, and then you have these two large canes sticking out. These are very awkward. They look great, but really they're going to be a kind of mismatch to the whole rest of this plant. But these are actually great structure for new growth coming in. So what I would do on both of these large canes is to go down to where this deck is and then look below. When you go below this, the new growth after you cut will come up into this section and fill it out. So you want to actually cut these things with a little bit more, you want to be a little bit more brutal with these. So the center of the plant is right in here. I want this growth to be coming out this way, so I'll look down here until I find a growth eye. There's a nice one down here at the base, and I'll cut right above it. On this one, I want the growth to head out this direction. This has already lost its lower leaves. It probably lost those fairly early in the season, and you can see the growth eyes They're all along the cane as small swellings, and I will cut right above one of those at an angle, and that, when the new growth comes in, it'll actually come out and end up about right here at bloom time. Now the rest of this rose, there's a little bit of congested growth down in the middle, and I will actually come and I prune these side canes off against the main canes coming out. I will actually take off the growth that's coming through the middle of the plant right against the side of the cane. Smaller side canes I'll take back to a few growth eyes. We've got crossing growth here. When you have established canes like this and there's small growth on the side, these will never get larger. This is all that will ever do. This, on a hybrid tea, this won't flower. On some of the other roses, some of the antique roses, Austin roses and things like that, a cane of this size can actually produce new flowers. On a hybrid tea or a floribunda or a grandiflora, it's not going to produce flowers. So you actually want to take these out. You want to clean them out. And again, as I said, you want to open up the middle of this plant, and I'll be taking off foliage as I go. When I have a rose that has an antique bloodline or one of the David Austin English roses, they have a lot more smaller, denser foliage. I will actually take the foliage off before I start the pruning process because I can't see the structure of the rose until that foliage is gone. On a hybrid tea, the inner nodes between the leaflets are actually large enough that you can kind of see the structure of the plant. It's not quite as important, so you can actually do your pruning like this. And always be checking for dead canes or any damaged canes from cane borers and other things, or sun scorched, things like that, as you go, and you can take those canes out entirely. The one thing that I do find about pruning a hybrid tea or a floribunda is if you make a mistake, they're fairly forgiving. When it gets to some of the antique roses and the Austin roses, you want to be a little bit more careful and know what you're, where you want to prune. On these, you can prune a little bit harder. I don't myself, because I'm using an organic approach to growing roses, everything about the process is slower. So I'm not going to prune a hybrid tea down to stumps. I've seen that done in a lot of gardens. They'll prune it down to only 6 inches. The rose is going to be struggling to grow back up to this height. It wants to be as big as it should be. You can't keep it smaller by pruning it, or if you do, you're going to lose all of your flowers. So you want to prune a hybrid tea, fairly hard, but I don't prune them so hard that they're spending all of their time trying to grow new foliage back again. We've got some, if you've got stuff growing in with your roses, I'm going to cut this out of here. Okay. So you can see I'm opening up a more vase shape in the middle of this plant. I'm keeping the main canes are providing your structure. Actually, this thing I think I might want to shorten here. That's probably going to be better. This is a main structural cane, and these side canes can be pruned down. You count up a couple of nodes from the base so that this will be support for new growth coming out. So one thing you can, I don't know if it's visible here, but in the pruning process last year, there was a stub of a cane left in between these two pieces of growth that never did anything. You actually want to always take those out. So I just always clip those out, and it will actually direct all of the growth that was just sitting in that useless cane back into the side canes. You'll get much better results. And I've snagged myself. And if you do find any, quite often you'll find dead stubs of canes where new growth has come off of both sides or off of more than one side. And those they're vectors for disease, so you actually want to cut those off as cleanly as possible when you find these. So what you're left with after a harder prune on a hybrid tea is this structure that looks like an open vase. So all of your growth is going to be coming out. It'll arch out from this vase and keep it open in the center of the plant. On these hybrid teas, floribundas, some of the more modern roses with larger leaves, the reason you want to do this is for air circulation through the middle, because most of our problems, at least in California, come on the foliage. The foliage is where we get black spot, mildew, rust, all of those other things. On an antique rose or a rose with smaller foliage, it isn't quite as necessary to clear out the middle of it, but on a sturdier hybrid tea or a floribunda, this is what you want to do. And there, I think that should be done. And now I would add my sulpo mag and alfalfa meal around this after cleaning out all of the old foliage at the base. Here's an example of an antique rose. This has been here for a little while. It isn't fully established. But one of the main things on an antique rose is, one of the things I like about them, is you don't have to do much pruning. The flowers can actually come on the smallest side stems on these roses. So the whole structure of this rose, if it's not congested or crossing, you want to leave as is. Now normally what I would do is strip all of this of foliage first before I did anything, but this is actually still open enough that I can see what I'm doing. So on something like this, which actually flowers right out at the ends here, you want to go down only just a few nodes. And that's as much pruning as you need to do on these things. You just take out all of the old spots where it's flowered. On something like this, if you want to keep this rounded shape and it's peeking up a little bit further, the same as we did on the hybrid tea, except a little less severe in the pruning, you want to go down below the level where you want it to end up and find a growth node. So I see one down here, and I'll prune down to that. And when this grows, the new side stems coming out will end up in the midst of all of this foliage, so we'll keep a nice rounded shape to it. So really all you're doing is taking out all of last year's old clusters of flowers. Those are the clusters on the ends. And then you'll come in and take off the foliage. Now this rose has not started its process of dropping its foliage. The foliage is actually hanging on really tightly. So you do have to go in, and I'm doing it barehanded. This Gerischer doesn't have a lot of really nasty thorns on it, so I actually can feel what I'm doing better when I'm doing this. I actually just go in and do this barehanded. You still have to be careful because you can tear yourself up, but you sort of pop off the foliage, it actually will make a little snapping sound. Now that's nice to do on something like this. On another type of plant, on some of the David Austin roses, you actually have to snip the foliage off. If you try and pop them off, you'll actually take some of the cane with it, and you don't want to do that. So just go up to any rose you're growing, and it'll kind of tell you itself that if you can do this, if you can just do the pinch and take the foliage off or not. So again, as I said, you really don't want to do much cutting on this. If there are congested canes or crossing canes that are touching each other, you may want to take one of those out. In a few years, some of these canes will actually have to be removed down to the base to promote new canes to grow in. But right now, this is a young plant, and all you want to do is keep this nice rounded shape because it blooms out at the ends. So that's the reason I tend to like these old roses. You got fragrance, you got beautiful flowers, and you don't have to do a lot of pruning. You just strip off the foliage, and that's pretty much it. So when I'm done pruning and I've cleaned up all of the dropped foliage under and the old foliage underneath the roses, I'll actually sometimes pull back some of the mulch if there's any mulch left, and I'll pull it away from the plant. At that point, what I do is, it's my treatment at the end of the year for after I've pruned roses. I will actually put down a product called Sulpomag. This is actually a natural mineral. It's called langbonite, and when it's mined, it's in a small granular form that breaks down fairly slowly. The Sulpomag, it's used very sparingly, probably only a tablespoon or two per plant. And it has sulfur, potassium, and magnesium in it, which actually help the soil, and it will provide soil. The breakdown of the organic fertilizers we'll be putting on later, it will help those minerals be and nutrients be absorbed by the rose, and actually the color, not only of the foliage but of the flowers, will improve. It changes stuff drastically. On top of the Sulpomag, I will actually put on alfalfa meal as well. This you can put on I put on a couple of cups full per plant and scatter it around the base of the plant. You do want to use agricultural alfalfa meal. I get questions all the time on, can I buy it at the feed store? Don't. Feed store alfalfa meal for animals has corn syrup in it. If you use it on the soil, it will actually make thick mats that will mold, and you'll have to peel the whole thing up and throw it away. And using alfalfa meal also promotes what's called cane break. And cane break sounds bad, but it actually means that new canes will form on a rose. One tool I didn't bring to show that I usually try and have with me is a brush for a wire brush for a barbecue. It sounds an odd tool to bring into the rose garden, but if you have a rose that only has a couple of canes on it and you'd like the plant to be fuller, you go down to the base of the rose where that graft union is, if it's a grafted rose or if it's an older rose that may be growing on its own roots, and take the wire brush and scrub away at the bark at the base of the plant until you see just a hint of green. The minute you see that living tissue, you can actually pile the alfalfa meal around that, and as that breaks down, you'll get new canes coming off of that section. So you can take a rose that only has a couple of canes on it, and within a couple of years you can have a nice rounded plant out of that if you do this every year. So what you're doing is actually you are stimulating new growth by irritating the rose, by irritating the tissues of the rose.